Good afternoon and welcome to History and Systems of Psychology. We are in week 13. Wow, okay. I think after this class we'll have 5 more classes together. So enjoyed teaching you this semester and we'll continue to enjoy that for our remaining 5 classes together. Today we are going to hopefully complete our discussion of Sigmund Freud. We have a video, we need to watch the rest of that video and then go through the PowerPoint. Following that, we're going to go ahead into the next chapter. Now, the chapter following Freud will not have, there won't be any content from that chapter on the exam. So I want to make sure that you understand that. And in fact, you'll only be responsible for Freud material up to where I left off on the study guide. Okay, so that'll be our first part of class, and then we will take some time to do a little quiz prep, and I have you in teams, and I have some great, very high-end Easter toys. Can anyone do this well? I can. All right. Okay. Anyway, I will perform later for money. So I take small bills or Venmo. That's actually easiest for me. All right. Tell me what you remember about Freud.
When he was like 4, family moved to Vienna.
Okay.
Moved out of Austria to London a year before he died.
Okay. Good. Yeah.
Just the big, everything revolves around sex.
Yes. Yes. So lots of items in that response. Good, Eric. Good starting us off. Others.
He believed that he was a pioneer in his way of thinking because of the backlash that he got.
Yes. And I was watching another video on Freud, and it spoke of something similar, that he was, he had a great big ego, which a lot of people who are famous and who are very well recognized in their field have large egos. It sort of takes that strong belief in yourself to put out all the theories he had, especially when it came to all the theories around sex, right? But he saw any criticism or, any naysayers as simply reaffirming his brilliance and his quote unquote rightness, which I thought was interesting. So that's a little bit of an indicator or insight into his personality. Good. What else?
He experimented with cocaine.
He experimented with cocaine, right? And he was a staunch supporter of cocaine for many, many years, right? Did he think it had anything harmful in it? No, which is amazing. Thinking about cocaine in today, I don't know how often you think about it. Hopefully not very often, but but anyway, cocaine was used widely around that time. It was used for anesthesia, so when doing surgery, and it was also put in old school Coca-Cola. So Coca-Cola, cocaine. All right. So those are good tidbits. Let's talk a little bit more about what you remember, because we did cover quite a bit in class.
Just like Freud in general before the video. Okay, sorry, I left before the video last class. He, believed in the Oedipus complex and the Electric complex. Grew up in Vienna. Nanny was Catholic, father was Jewish. Confused him a lot as a child.
Yeah, so that was a point of a lot of frustration when it came to religion. You can imagine if you're getting these 2 powerful influences in your life saying, believe this, and believe this, and if you don't believe this, then bad things are going to happen. If you don't believe this, then bad things are going to happen. As a child, I can only imagine how confusing that would be. Eventually, the dad discarded the nanny, for lack of a better descriptor on that. So Freud's childhood was not a particularly happy one, at least as I've seen it painted, but very serious. He was a serious student, and his father was a strict disciplinarian. Okay, we talked about the Freud, no, see, that's a Freudian slip maybe, the Oedipal and the Electra complex, right? And how that related to being attracted to the opposite sex parent and then having to realign yourself with the same sex parent. Let's see, what else? Id, ego, and superego. All right, if we think about this as an iceberg, which is a frequent analogy, what would be at the bottom, so in the water? The id, okay, so those are our unconscious impulses, right? And Freud believed we were really driven by those impulses. We don't act upon them as much because of what? That stands high above.
Superego.
Superego, all right? So ego is our point of existence, and that's where we balance the wants of the id, and superego might be more like the needs of the superego. And so that's a balancing act that some people perform better than others. And we probably perform that better when we're not under a lot of stress, right? So you can maybe think back to a time where you might have had a lot going on, and all of a sudden you find that you're really not acting in accordance to who you are, right? Maybe at the end of the semester. So you may be a little bit more id-driven than at other times. I might need to coin that phrase, id-driven. All right. Freud was not the first person to come up with this idea of the unconscious, but in psychology, we frequently cite him as the most influential. So he took this idea, he expanded on it, he gave names, gave a name to the unconscious as the id, and he really was focused on the strong role that our unconscious plays in our lives, in the decisions that we make, in the environments we place ourselves in our relationships, most definitely, right? Okay, he was the founder of psychoanalysis, right? Okay, and what was that? Like for you to describe a little bit of the method. He wasn't doing Zoom, right? He wasn't doing Zoom interviews at that point. I don't know what he would have to say about Zoom therapy, but he'd probably have something to say about it. Yeah. So pre-Zoom.
Didn't it look a lot into like dreams and behavior that's like when you aren't able to control stuff, kind of?
Yes. When I think of Freud, I think of the very stereotypical, you have like this chaise lounge and someone's arms are crossed, and maybe they're looking upward or looking in, and then you have like a bespectacled person that's in a chair, and is writing things down on the notepad and nodding their head, right? So that's the idea that really came into being around Freud's time, and it's still practiced that way in a variety of therapeutic approaches, but more often than not now, you will not be sitting on a chaise lounge if you are getting therapy, all right? His idea was if people have neuroses, or hysteria, which he believed was something found not only in women but also in men, that had something to do with how you had grown up, right? And how you had progressed through the stages of development. So he said that there were 4 stages of development that, barring some sort of disability or severe abnormality, people go through around the same period of time, all right? His idea was that development is successfully navigating through a series of crises. So if I ask you on the exam how he viewed crisis, he didn't view it as a negative thing. He viewed it as an essential item in terms of our development, okay? A lot of development, he placed the, I'll say blame, or he placed a lot of emphasis on how the parents raised the child and those foundational experiences. So by talking about those experiences in childhood, Freud believed that he could help people get better. He did this alongside dream analysis, and it makes sense. I think the dream analysis part makes a lot of sense considering Freud had an early introduction through Charcot into hypnosis, okay? So he believed in the power of hypnotherapy, but he didn't think that you needed to put someone under, right, hypnotize them to help them. And so his approach in some ways is similar to hypnotherapy, but the idea is you would come in and tell him a dream. And I think I asked you how many of you are kind of lucid dreamers, but you know, with those kinds of dreams, there can be a lot to unpack. So he would have you talk about the manifest content, which is what content of a dream first. Yeah, exactly. So whatever images, they might be really bizarre, what have you, you would have the literal storyline, and then you would have the latent content, which is the meaning behind the storyline. And depending on who is your dream analyst, they might interpret it differently. But Freud would take what's going on in someone's life, maybe what went on in the past, and that would likely influence how he would analyze a person's dream. Okay. He also viewed dreams as a way that we work out situations in our lives, or that we address repressed thoughts. So in dreams, like anything goes, right? And he believed that was a way for us to work through some things, maybe items that we don't want to deal with directly, that we push down, that kind of pop out in that dream. Okay, anything else? Okay, well hopefully there'll be else after we finish watching this video. I believe that I've started in the right place. When we finished up, I know close to the end of our class together, the speaker on the video was discussing artwork, right? And there were some different artists, such as Gustav Klimt, who were discussed briefly. So, genius of the modern world, which Sigmund considered himself, continued. Here we go. Hopefully I've adjusted the audio so it doesn't blast your ears.
Feelings weren't resolved. Internal conflicts would be stored up, only to cause adult neuroses later in life. Freud was keen to test out his theories about repressed sexual issues. And in October 1900, the opportunity arose to do just that. A new patient walked into his office, a 17-year-old girl who he'd give the pseudonym Dora. She was his first and his most famous case study. Dora was exhibiting hysterical symptoms, a nervous cough, and suicidal thoughts.
One of the most shocking things in the story is that when she was 13 or 14, her father's best friend, Herr K., manipulated the situation to get her alone in his office and kissed her. Freud says, well, this was thoroughly hysterical, that she was disgusted by the kiss. And then he goes on to say that she must have felt his erect penis against her body, and that this must have sexually aroused her. And he makes it his business, really, to show her that she really does sexually desire Herr K, and that she's repressed that desire from consciousness.
I have to say, when you look at Dora's case, there does seem to be a trope developing here, that you have these young women who are very troubled, and men like Freud kind of pounce on them to use them for medical material.
Yes, it has the sort of arrogance of the man of science, and that he uses Dora and other patients as simply guinea pigs for his confident scientific position.
How does it end? I mean, how does Dora take all of this?
Not well. Dora walks out on Freud. And what he learns from that, though, is that he should have paid attention to the way in which she had transferred onto him all her feelings of hostility to Herr K. And in fact, after this case, he introduced the theory that psychoanalysis must pay attention to the ways in which patients transfer their unconscious and conscious feelings about significant people in their lives onto the psychoanalyst or the therapist.
Freud learnt valuable lessons from the Dora case. Yet his seemingly scientific method relied on subjective, some would argue self-fulfilling judgments. It was a fundamental problem articulated by his once loyal confidant Fleece during a heated argument. The reader of thoughts is merely reading his own thoughts into other people, was Fleece's damning assessment.
Taxes was taxing. Now taxes is relaxing when you file for free.
I can file for free? TurboTax Free Edition.
In 1902, Freud sent out a written invitation to 4 Jewish doctors, inviting them to come and meet here in his apartments. What would come to be known as the Wednesday Psychological Society gathered every week in his waiting room, and their first topic was a subject very close to Freud's own heart: the psychological function of smoking. A good cigar after a meal was part of bourgeois Viennese culture, but Freud took cigar indulgence to a whole new level. He smoked 20 cigars a day and considered the pleasures of the cigar a substitute for what he called the single greatest habit: masturbation. The Wednesday group discussions helped Freud to advance his ideas on sexuality, resulting in a groundbreaking publication: 3 essays on the theory of sexuality.
So what he does in this book, he introduces a concept of enlarged sexuality. Because at the time, sexuality was very much restricted to people having sex. Whereas for Freud, it's about eroticism, it's about attraction, it's about excitement and everything in between. He also sees it being at work in children.
I mean, that's very controversial, isn't it? So how does he see this sex drive, this libido developing in children?
Shortly after a child is born, it goes through an oral phase. Freud observes that when a child is being fed, that it can derive some satisfaction or gratification from that, which allows us to look at that experience as something that can be deservedly called erotic.
So he thinks he's identified this sex drive in children. In what way does he see this playing out in adult life?
It plays out insofar as it informs our sexual identity, our sexual fantasies, our sexual orientation. It informs who we are as human beings. But it's not a formula. Each and every individual has to find his or her way through this process. As a result of which, in a sense, one could say that we are all equally abnormal.
There is a possibility, though, isn't there, that he's got this all wrong? That it's not all about sex?
Yes, people have said Freud's got it all wrong, but I think if we use an enlarged concept of sexuality, we actually do come to the conclusion that a lot of our mental world is conditioned by this drive.
Freud's progressive theories of sexuality spoke to a generation of young Viennese, cynical about the church and repressive morality. But his growing popularity had its dangers. Freud feared, not without reason, that because his circle was mainly Jewish, anti-Semitism would mean that his ideas would never be fully accepted. He was anxious that psychoanalysis would be labelled a Jewish science. A solution came in the form of a Swiss Gentile from Zurich who visited him in 1907.
I was then a very young man still, and he was the old man, so I settled down to learn something first.
Carl Jung was one of the brightest young psychiatrists of the day. Freud bestowed rapturous praise on him, and in return, Jung came to revere Freud. Given Freud's antipathy to religion, it's rather ironic that his movement was beginning to look a bit like a religious cult, with psychosexuality its key doctrine, Freud its high priest, and Jung the evangelist who promote Freud's message. But the evangelist soon became a heretic. Jung reinterpreted one of Freud's key terms, libido, which Freud understood as sexual drive, to mean all mental energy. And he also took issue with what he saw as Freud's obsessive focus on the Oedipus complex.
When he had thought something, then it was settled, while I was doubting all along the line.
Their friendship ended acrimoniously, with Freud calling Jung crazy and out of his wits, while Jung's parting shot was no less provocative. Your technique of treating your pupils like patients is a blunder. In that way, you produce either slavish sons or impudent puppies. I am objective enough to see through your little trick. But whilst Freud faced dissent and a splintering of his movement, his name and his ideas were to reach global prominence due to a pivotal event. In 1914, the heir to the Habsburg throne was assassinated, triggering a war with Serbia. Freud's sons left for the front line of a conflict that would become World War I. The war threw up new challenges for physicians. The mysterious breakdowns suffered by soldiers. Their disconnected speech and nightmares were diagnosed as symptoms of physical shocks to the brain, shell shock. But it quickly became apparent that soldiers who weren't operating on the front line, who weren't exposed to exploding shells, were also suffering. So the physiological explanations just didn't stand up.
I've placed information vital to the survival of the rebellion into the SAR 2 unit.
Often written off as cowardly or weak, many of these soldiers were forced back into action within a few days. But Freud started a debate which would lead to today's widely accepted condition of post-traumatic stress disorder. Freud believed that war neurosis was a psychological rather than a physical problem. He thought that shell shock must be an emotional trauma triggered by the horrors of conflict. And by the end of the war, others were starting to believe him. World War I was a breakthrough moment for the psychoanalytical movement. But for Freud personally, it cast a long shadow. Post-war inflation wiped out most of his savings, undermining his comfortable life in Vienna. Spanish flu swept through the city, killing his beloved daughter Sophie. And even though all his sons returned, they were scarred by the experience. Freud began to question some of his core theories. For him, sexuality had been singularly responsible for neuroses. But in 1920, he published Beyond the Pleasure Principle and posited a second basic force in the mind: a death drive. Before, he'd seen aggression as a sadistic aspect of the sexual instinct, the urge for mastery, the drive to dominate the sexual object. But now, with the raw experience of humanity's dreadful capacity for self-destruction, he started to focus instead on the fatal psychological impulses within us. Freud wanted us to face up to inward as well as outward aggression. He suggested that the death drive was part of the human condition, a powerful, deep-seated wish to undo the bonds of life. But Freud's revisions didn't end here. Freud proposed that the mind was made up of three elements. There was the id, an entirely unconscious part, the cauldron of our passions, where our death drive and our urge for sex could be found. Then there was what he called the superego, an internal conscience which could impose impossible ideals and inflict merciless criticism. The superego was a kind of strict moral guardian, in conflict with the pleasure and death-seeking urges of the id. Navigating between the warring mind and external reality was what Freud called the ego. Freud thought that psychoanalysis could help to strengthen the ego. Although he never imagined that we'd be free of these internal conflicts, the best we can do is simply to live with them. Freud's ideas were eagerly taken up by a post-war generation in revolt against traditional values. In Europe and the US, a new egocentric permissiveness embodied in the glamour-driven world of dance music and moving pictures was taking hold. In 1925, the head of MGM, Samuel Goldwyn, called Freud the greatest love specialist in the world and reportedly offered him $100,000 to advise on the making of Antony and Cleopatra. Freud curtly declined. Yet as Freud's cultural influence soared, other, more insidious forces were gathering. Forces which would threaten his very existence. In neighbouring Germany, Adolf Hitler rose to power. Jews were immediately targeted, and Freud's books were burnt in the streets. In 1938, troops marched into Vienna.
It's me. And that is the crowd cheering Hitler. Look at the crowd. That's our house with the swastikas on it.
Just days later, the Gestapo knocked at his door. Martha, ever the good host, asked them to leave their rifles in the umbrella stand. They behaved appallingly, throwing their weight around and breaking into the safe. But a line was crossed when they ransacked Martha's kitchen and tossed her table linen onto the floor. She gave them a thorough tongue lashing, and they left. Freud now realised that he had to escape. But it's here we can start to get a measure of the broad appeal that Freud was starting to enjoy. Wildly disparate players collaborated to secure his safe passage, from the American president to a descendant of Napoleon, and even a Nazi bureaucrat who'd been blown away by his work when he was a student. For the second time in his life, Freud would be displaced. After 78 years in Vienna, his belongings were hastily packed up. This trunk in the Freud Museum in Vienna has revealed poignant new evidence of Freud's traumatic break with the past.
We kind of rediscovered it after it had been sitting right in this corner for like 2 decades.
Yeah.
And when we moved it, we discovered this, a label of Wien Westbahnhof to London.
Ah, so
because one thing that we discovered was very exciting to us, a squashed little box bearing Freud's handwriting, stating, Martha, for your 21st birthday, from a poor happy man.
wow. It's a tiny little thing, isn't it? But that is freighted with history and memory.
Yes, absolutely. Even without the jewelry inside, but still keeping the box with this personal little message.
Yeah. What Freud encouraged us to do was to face up to our own pasts so that we could live better lives.
Yes.
And here is Freud and Martha's past incarnate. It's very moving.
Check it out. At Planet Fitness, you can get free fitness training.
We're mixing it up.
We're not slowing down. I'm checking my phone.
Im Alter von 82 Jahren verließ ich infolge der deutschen Invasion mein Heim in Wien und kam nach England, wo ich mein Leben in Freiheit zu enden hoffe.
That is when 3 men of the Royal Society came to present the book of the Royal Society for signature to my father. And I think on that same picture is the signature of Darwin. That was a very nice moment.
But Freud was frail and severely ill.
We had this couch put up for my father to rest. That's in his last year already.
For around 15 years, his jawbone was riddled with cancer. Despite over 30 operations that affected his hearing and his heart, he refused to surrender the oral pleasure that was almost certainly killing him. When his mouth was too painful to open, he'd wedge it with a clothes peg, just wide enough so he could smoke a cigar. He set up his study, just as it had been arranged in Vienna, and continued to see patients. When Freud sensed that death was near, he asked for his bed to be brought down here so he could be close to his desk, his books, and his beloved collection of ancient artifacts. In September 1939, Freud arranged to be given a fatal dose of morphine. But even after death, Freud's ideas continued to gain momentum.
One of the impetuses that Freud gave to the 20th century was giving people permission to be different from other people, to recognize that there is very little that is abnormal because the abnormal is so normal. And perhaps most important of all, really making it possible to talk about sex. That really, I think, helped hugely. In the century after Freud's time, homosexuality, sexual variety, much more sympathetic understandings about things that just used to be thought of as perverse. That was a big, big change in our sensibility, certainly of the Western world anyway, and something for which we should thank him.
There is an issue though, isn't there? Because some of his ideas, I mean, it's not just pop science, it's positively bad science.
It may even not be science at all, really, because the empirical basis for Freud's work is incredibly slender. I mean, he self-analyzed, he analyzed his wife and daughter, and a few neurotic Viennese ladies. And this is a very poor starting point for any real theory.
He looked a lot at the unconscious. How far does that stand up against what we now know from science, from neuroscience, for example?
Well, of course, neuroscience is making enormous strides now that there are instruments like the MRI scanner, the magnetic resonance imaging scanner, and we've learned quite a lot. One thing we've learned is that most mental computation takes place in a non-conscious way, below the level of consciousness. And so memory is stored, physically stored in the brain. And this must mean that many of the layers of as it were, psychic deposits of all our lives are in there and could be recovered. And so it's not a million miles away from what Freud was groping for.
He had the kind of strength to imagine what we're now understanding to be true.
That's exactly right. He was an imaginative genius, a wonderful storyteller. And, you know, even if you do a destructive job, which is you tear down a conventional fabric of ideas, that gives us an opportunity to see things differently. And I think he had enough wonderful insight to have struck the bell just very occasionally in ways that make us think this is an interesting aspect, an interesting perspective on human experience.
At US Cellular, you don't have to choose between a great deal on the phone you want and the phone plan that's right for you.
While theories like the Oedipus complex and death drive have been widely questioned, there's no doubting Freud's huge cultural influence. His ideas have become so embedded, they're buried so deep within our day-to-day experiences that we take them for granted. So when advertisers scrutinise consumers to create brands that appeal to our irrational desires, they are drawing on Freud's psychoanalytical techniques. It's one of the reasons that products are packaged in ways that promise youthful freedom, prestige, and of course, sex appeal. And Freud's influence is also there in how we make sense of who we are. The importance that we place on childhood experiences. Our openness to talk about the emotional complexity of our lives. Some people even see his focus on looking inwards as promoting our narcissistic, individualistic culture, making us self-absorbed, self-obsessed. What really mattered to Freud, I'd argue, is right here. His ashes are still in this ancient urn, one of his favourites, which celebrates the Greek god Dionysus, the god of wild, irrational impulses. So here in his final resting place, you have sex and lust and death and mania and the power of the past all mixed up together. For a man who told the world he was a scientist, this is a madly, wonderfully romantic last gesture. And a reminder too, perhaps, that Freud believed no matter how deeply we interrogate ourselves, there is an irrational part of our mind destined to stay in the dark. It's true that many of Freud's theories have been dismissed as wildly speculative, criticised for being unscientific. But the questions that he left us with are as cogent now as they were back then. Are we hostages to our pasts and to our hidden anxieties? Or can we ever learn to understand our psyches, to be truly masters of our own minds?
Okay, I hope you learned a lot from that video and enjoyed it. I thought it was very well done, and I always love to see like the architecture and get a feeling of like his place in the world. I'd like to separate you into 3 groups right now, and so let's have a group right here. Let's have a trio right here, and if you can roll down toward this group. Take about 5 minutes to share your takeaways, anything you found interesting, possibly disagreed with, and then we'll discuss as a class.
You were surprised that she got mad. Yes, it was crazy.
The Dora case study. Situation thing where it's like, actually, you should enjoy the kiss. And his participants in this, and where it kind of like refined his theories a little bit more.
It was interesting.
Straws is still small.
Psychological society,
Or the surgeries and stuff.
Jewish doctors.
Crazy. Determined, I guess.
This all that he created it.
Communities on society to like discuss things.
It's pretty crazy that he spoke to one
It's like, I guess not his acceptance, but it led to the acceptance of like PTSD with how far it is now. Like it's
So she kind of said it was like he studied human sexuality enough to where it made people realize that it's more than just like sex in general. It's more of the attractions and desires in life. It's more to it. Just doing it.
also like the fact that his books were burned in the street because of Hitler. It's crazy that he was so threatened by him.
Beyond the principle that someone to war. And he's called the greatest love socialist at a point.
I didn't get anything good notes about him. I just wrote that they fell apart, but I don't know what they did.
Insulted one another and how we treated his patients, how we just kind of used them.
So they were accomplices, and then it didn't work. It's kind of like It's where the depth of sex drive can be found. Super ego is the strict moral guardian, and then here's the battlefield where our personalities are.
It says, or it's like crazy.
That's my last bullet point.
Realizing you're saying these things, so you're like, check out the computer.
Took his drive or
See a little back there.
Some internet during.
Yes.
Okay.
Be worse. Usually so much worse.
Bro chose like assisted suicide, basically. Yeah.
Always like that's very fitting.
Not necessarily sexual satisfaction, just from that age, like that's how we actually satisfy our needs. And then a little bit later, like, we've got to that, so it's when we're trying
Oh my gosh. Crazy. Actually crazy.
I can't figure it out.
How'd you know?
that's the exercise that controls.
It's kind of like
Are we good over here?
he thought sex drive was just a sex
3 good? Okay.
This is how it's like, I mean, it's what I want, this is how I get what I want right now.
All right, who would like to go first?
Someone else go.
Oh, okay, you're gonna allow someone else to go. How kind and benevolent and altruistic of you. All right. I think going first is great because you get to cover things that, right at the start, right? So having said that, what are some of your takeaways?
I was sorry. He says like the most out of pocket things. Like he would believe that he's like such like a noble person for like saying these things out loud.
Yes.
I think it's actually great. I was so shocked when Dora was like kissed by her dad's best friend.
Yes.
It's like, why doesn't she like it? Like she must be hysterical.
Mm-hmm.
And I literally had to write it down because I was like, no way he's actually saying that. She must have known.
No one but you are saying that, Freud, right?
Yes.
And then he was surprised whenever she got upset. It's like,
Yeah, like hello, right?
we talked about the Wednesday Psychological Society with a group of Jewish men. They would
Okay.
talk about the theories. They had the 3 theories of sexuality books that they published.
Excellent. 1 or 2 more.
He talked about the death drive and how that helped them come up with the idea of the id, ego, and superego, and how the id was the sexuality and like the want for like to end, undo bonds of life, and then like superego is like morals preventing us from doing that.
Right, like our conscience. Uh-huh.
Also talking about the beyond the pleasure principle that came after his kids went into war, like World War I.
Right, uh-huh.
Focus on the psychological impulses and like inward and outward aggression with it.
So he really went beyond sexuality and expanded his theory at that point.
Yeah.
All right, good start, group 1. Group 2.
So one of them mentioned like the seduction theory
Uh-huh.
that leads to the neurosis, how it was just kind of like, I think all 3 of us just made us like roll our eyes.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
It's just
Yeah.
very biased, very one-sided,
Mm-hmm.
just an opinion piece.
And one thing I will say about that is, well, I'll say a couple of things, is throwing that out there was a brand new thing to throw out. And if we look through, different ways of looking at history, if we look through modern day lenses at some of his theories, we really roll our eyes. And probably you might still do that, like were you living during his time period, but I do think at the same time it's important to consider the socio-cultural impact of all of that, and how as we've grown in the discipline of psychology, people have found alternatives to psychoanalysis, right? But there's still kernels of that seep through lots of different things. Good. Something else from this group?
It just had a really long-lasting impact on how we understand or seek to understand the mind, like sexuality, like unresolved trauma.
Right.
How one point, basically he and his colleagues were using hysterical women as guinea pigs. Pretty much.
Yeah, and in the video, the speaker talked about the fact that the empirical evidence, right, the real world evidence based on observations and work with people was not great to support his theory as a whole. He took his observations and work with a limited number of hysterical women, or let's say women with hysteria, right, and then formed his or refined his psychoanalytic approach based on that. Whereas there are some psychologists that we studied earlier that would have been aghast by that, right? Like there's not the empirical evidence that more experimental psychologists would seek to see. Okay, good job. Second group. Third group.
One thing that I pointed out was like things that he did led to the acceptance of PTSD, and with how like prominent that is now, I feel like that's really important. Not funny thing that we was that he smoked 20 cigars a day, and then whenever he got done, proceeded to put basically a brick in his mouth so that he could smoke one.
Yeah, that's pretty terrible to think of. And if you watch Freud's Last Session, that's it's a big part of the movie because it's close to his death, and so we see this prosthetic device he has in his mouth, and there's definitely a little bit of a fixation, as it were, on the oral part of that. What else? Everyone with me?
Also, like how I guess like threatened Hitler and all of his people were by him. They burned his books in the streets.
That's pretty amazing, right? Yeah. Didn't want those ideas to get out because they didn't conform with Nazi ideals. Correct? Yeah. Anything else you'd like to share? Or any of the other two groups that you'd like to share? Okay. I want to elaborate on just a couple of items. You mentioned a lot of the items that I have in my notes. Let's talk a little bit more about the early, Freud contributed a lot to our understanding there was such a thing as PTSD, right? Now, and this was again linked to the war. You can see time and time again throughout history the link between psychology and wars that are going on. I find it really interesting. Did he feel that only people who had shot at others or been in combat were affected by shell shock? No. What did he have to say about that?
I think he thought shell shock was an emotional response to the war. He said about like people that weren't in combat.
Yeah, that they could still have that emotional response, right? It's one thing to have to fire a gun, potentially killing people. It's another thing to watch that, right? But he saw both of those experiences as having the ability, maybe that's not the right word, to result in PTSD. Okay, so early work on PTSD, where PTSD really took off this idea of a diagnosis and getting help for people suffering from that, was after the Vietnam War. If any of you have read the work of van der Kolk and The Body Keeps the Score, van der Kolk does a lot on somatic therapy and how what we experience, the good and the bad, lives in our bones and muscles and impacts us on a level that we're not often aware of. But he is someone who was doing internship or residency at a clinic for Vietnam veterans who were suffering from PTSD. And he saw that traditional therapy, talk therapy, wasn't doing much except rehashing what they already felt. So really having them relive an event over and over. And what he added to the understanding is that maybe that experience or experiences have been pushed down so far that talking about it doesn't do any good. So he believed that the power of movement can be used to help unlock some of those buried memories so that they can then be discussed and viewed from an objective standpoint rather than continuing to live out those memories. That's just a little bit of an aside. Okay. You mentioned about the enlarged sexuality to include eroticism, attraction, and excitement. In the video, it was mentioned briefly about the transfer of maybe id impulses from the, like how the patient might start to view the therapist as maybe a father figure or someone to direct their anger toward, right? So we can have that happening in therapy. And Freud, in terms of his theory, was not the doubt everything philosophers of long ago, right? We had a lot of philosophers who said, we're not going to accept anything as truth. We're going to have to delve into that. And so he was definitely someone who didn't feel very doubtful about many aspects of his theory. Although saying that, he did expand his theory and change it over the years. So really very, very important in numerous ways. I want to quickly go through this PowerPoint and then do a little quiz so that you're feeling pretty prepped for the exam. Remember, in addition to the exam guide content, you will have questions related to the videos, so I have those posted for you to review. Okay. We've talked about a lot of this. Freud is known as the father of psychoanalysis. Eric, you gave us some information related to his early years. He was in medical school, right? And once he graduated from medical school, where did he work briefly, or with what kind of patients did he work?
Traumatic brain injuries, was it?
He worked with patients with traumatic brain injuries, similar to Penfield, who specialized in not so much traumatic brain injuries, but epilepsy. Okay, so he was interested in that, what can be used to help these individuals, right? But his introduction to hypnotism changed the course of his studies. Even as a physician, he was not fully in on that, right? As a practitioner, he still had a strong focus on research during that time. So research, interestingly enough, for someone who's criticized for not having research-based practices, was very important to him in his younger years. Okay, psychodeterminism proposes that underlying psychological factors cause symptoms and other behaviors to occur. And an example that's given is the impact of traumatic events as causes of psychopathology. There's a measure that is called the ACE, and what does that stand for? Have you heard of that measure? Adverse Childhood Experiences. And so there are various events that a child might be part of or witness prior to the age of 18. And each event, if you put a check mark, that counts as 1 point. And you add up the ACE scores on that. And as ACE scores go up, of course, issues go up. Right, so that the ACE is used a lot to determine level of trauma a person has been through in their early life. That's not to say later trauma isn't important and doesn't influence our behavior, but especially things that happen earlier in life when you don't have a lot of control of anything, right? So if you're being abused in the household, but you know, mom and dad are the ones that are feeding you, you've got to figure out a way to live in that household and survive in that household. Okay, we've talked about this quite a bit. Some effects of unconscious motivation. Conversion hysteria is a form of neuroses in which psychological conflicts are expressed in physical symptoms. And we know that today to be something called psychosomatic. Let's say that you've been having a bad stomach ache for the last 6 weeks, and you go to the doctor, you go to the gastroenterologist, and they get you in really quickly, which doesn't happen a lot, but let's just say that that happens, right? And they examine you and run all the tests and put the tubes where tubes need to be to look at you. Sorry, kind of gross. And they can see
no physical reason or physiological reason for you having these symptoms, right? So it's an idiopathic symptom, meaning there's no physiological cause that we can cite. But instead, it may be something psychological. So it could be that you've started within the past 2 months a job and it's super stressful. You're not really recognizing that. So you're just kind of pushing ahead, and it's a lot of work to hold down a full-time job and go to school full-time. And so it could be that those stomach aches are a result of that stress you're experiencing, and it's manifesting itself in a physical symptom. Sort of makes sense? Yeah? Okay. So psychosis is when the unconscious goes haywire. At its extreme, you can experience auditory or visual hallucinations. Okay, we talked about dreams or heard about dreams, the royal road to the unconscious, the manifest and latent content representing the recalled story and interpretation, respectively. Freudian slips are when we make sort of a faux pas in our speaking, and it represents maybe a base impulse of ours. It comes out and you're immediately like, oh my gosh, I can't believe I said that. But Freud would say that's because that was on your mind, all right? Humor, he was a strong proponent for humor as a way to release unconscious conflicts, okay? And he also was someone who supported the use of projective tests. So when we talk about a lot of the research in psychology, we're using Likert scales to determine certain behaviors, maybe levels of happiness, well-being, motivation. But there's also a place for projective tests such as the TAT, which is the thematic apperception test, and the Rorschach, which I always say wrong, but that's the ink blot test. So if we think about the ink blot test, you would have some sort of ink blot, go figure, and you would be asked to interpret what that means. So if we look here, what are you seeing?
Two birds.
Two birds, okay.
I say two wolves.
Two wolves, okay.
Face of a wolf.
Yeah, I see like a wolf with bat wings on its ears. Okay. Anyone see something like a butterfly? Or your mother? Like that would be something that he might have something to say about, okay. That looks just like my mom. Or how
It's like the pelvic structure.
Yeah, I see that too, pelvic structure, okay, which would lead Freud to be happy to hear that because he could unpack a whole lot, right? He could bleed meaning into that. The thematic apperception test is something where you're given a picture to look at or a painting, and you're describing what's going on in it. And there are answers. Of course, people who give these tests are trained in it, but certain answers would indicate that you're okay, and certain other answers might indicate, not so much. Repression, we do this a lot. There's personal experience in the hedonic hypothesis. One last thing I want to cover is this idea of the energy hypothesis. If we're repressing something, that requires energy, all right, to repress maybe your anger, right? That's going to take energy away and tie up that energy so that you have less energy and less prefrontal cortex area to deal with your current reality, okay? This is, whether you know it or not, sometimes we're repressing and we definitely know it, right? You're like, this is really inappropriate to do in this setting. But then there's less of your brain really able to function effectively in that moment. So you can imagine if someone represses all the time, what that might do in their everyday life. Okay. 3 anxieties that he discussed were neurotic, moral, and reality anxiety. And Freud, the last thing I want to say here is he talked a lot about defense mechanisms. A lot of us are practiced in the art of denial, right? So we don't acknowledge painful aspects of our reality. We might even say, well, that didn't really happen, or deny something happening. Reaction formation. The ego unconsciously switches from unacceptable impulses into their opposites. So I'll have to think of a good example for that. Projection. People disguise their own threatening impulses by attributing them to others. This is very, it's known to happen a lot in relationships when maybe someone's cheating on the other person, and the person who's cheating is like, well, where were you? You know, what were you doing? All of these things. Putting that person as the perpetrator when in reality it's they're feeling guilt about that, right? And their super ego is saying, you know, this is a guilty thing, or you should feel guilt. Displacement, shifting sexual or aggressive impulses toward a more acceptable or less threatening object or person. We could think about maybe someone who becomes a dentist, okay? So this is someone who has some aggressive tendency, right? And they're going to take that aggressive tendency and put it to use for good. I don't know, it's a little bit of a stretch, you know, but like with the drills and all of that, so. And then rationalization, offering self-justifying explanations in place of real, more threatening reasons for your actions, okay? So rationalizing something you did or something that you said. Okay. All right, let's break into two groups. Jasmine, can you join this side of the room? And we're gonna do a quiz now for one of these many high-end Easter items. We'll say items. I didn't get chocolate this time because I was like, I think everyone will pick chocolate, so. Okay, so quickly into groups. We're gonna go back and forth. First question for this group. Who is the psychologist who coined the terms will and habit? Without your notes or your book or anything, yeah. We're gonna play fair. Okay, 5, 4, 3, 2, do you have an answer?
Skinner.
This group. Will and habit. William James. Okay, 0 points for anyone. Okay. This couple is known for their doll experiment.
Talking about this.
Oh my god, what are their names?
Was it a Martha?
Mamie and yes.
The Clarks?
Clark.
Uh-huh.
Kenneth Clark and Mamie Clark or something.
Yeah, Clark Phipps. All right, I'll give it to you. Yay! 1 point for team A. All right. Okay.
Choice.
Describe team B, the paired associates technique. Quickly.
Number with a color. Number is paired with a color. You name one to recall the other.
Okay.
She found that the more vivid colors elicited a stronger recall.
Okay, good. And she was who? Mary?
I was like, we know the one.
What, this side, can you say it?
Calkins.
Calkins, yes, all right. You don't get a point for that, but okay. Let's see. This team, what is radical environmentalism? Okay, ideas, this team. I'm trying to pull some tricky ones out and I think I succeeded, didn't I?
Yeah.
Radical environmentalism is a concept that the environment is responsible for who we are as people. Okay, so it's taking that to a really, yeah. I'll stop talking because we have more questions. Okay. What is generalization and differentiation?
Generalization, it was like when they did the experiment and it's something that's very similar, the Pavlov experiment, for example, like you could show something very similar to get the same stimuli versus differentiation, which is a different object, right?
Yeah, good. Okay, what is a baquette or a baquet? This group.
Was that the tub that,
Yes, keep going.
not Gassner, was it Gassner?
Mesmer?
It's Mesmer.
So it was a tub and?
Filled with like magnetized water, like glass bottles and iron rods.
Good, good. And that was used to mesmerize people, right? Okay. All right, we're neck and neck at 2 and 2. How exciting. All right, this person is known as the most famous female hysterical patient. Queen of Hysteria is her name. Yes, Blanche Whitman. Okay. What researcher examined the role of obedience, or to what extent people would be obedient to someone in a position of power? Milgram, good, good. Oh my gosh, okay. 2 more. This was the social experiment where people were given like various lengths of lines and asked to pick the line that was a certain length.
Ash experiment.
Ash experiment, do we agree? Okay. All right.
Solomon Ash.
Okay, this person came up with the Stanford Prison Experiment.
William Zimbardo.
Yes, good. All right, everyone won. How is that? Oh my gosh. So now is the exciting moment where you can pick up a host of gifts from this. So not everyone at once. So go ahead. This is like your treasure box from elementary school. Okay, so grab a gift for yourself quickly, and then I will see you on Thursday without gifts.
And you said the test opens tomorrow?
Yes, So we have this. We have notes. We have bubbles. The bubbles will need a little, let me give you a thing, yeah. Your daughter would like that, I think. Yeah. Well, bring some, you want to bring a stamp to her too?
Oh yeah, she loves these things.
All right.
Thank you.
Yeah, of course. Let me give you a green thing. So there are stamps in here.
Is this like slime?
It is, yes. I think it is. Yeah.
There you go.
Oh, how kind. You're such a kind group.
Our personality test is tomorrow, correct?
Yes, it is.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Yeah, have a good day.